sa tapat. Pag sinaking ano.
Still with this guy? He can't even afford a nice car.
Walk away, Sterling. This doesn't need to go anywhere.
Stop it! You're embarrassing me in front of real people. I am so tired of pretending you're enough.
Get my plane ready. I'm going home to run my company.
The candle between us flickered when the waiter set down her wine, and I remember thinking, this is the night I finally give her everything. 5 years. That's how long Lyra and I had been together, and tonight, on our anniversary, at the Apex Lounge 60 floors above Chicago, I planned to ask her to marry me. Not that we weren't already promised to each other in every way that mattered, but I wanted the ring on her finger before the year ended. I'd designed it myself. 3 weeks with a jeweler on Michigan Avenue, sketching and resketching until it looked like something worth a lifetime. I slid the velvet box across the white tablecloth. Her eyes dropped to it, and for 1 second, just one, I saw something flicker across her face. That wasn't joy, it was calculation. I didn't have time to name the feeling before a shadow fell over our table. Well, well, look who's still slumming it. Sterling Vance Hayes. I knew him by reputation. Old money, new arrogance. The kind of man who inherited a company and mistook it for building one. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and a smirk that had clearly never been slapped off his face, which struck me as an oversight the universe would eventually correct. Sterling, I said evenly, this is a private table. He ignored me completely, turning to Lyra instead. Lyra, darling, still letting this one dress you? I saw the car you two pulled up in, a leased sedan. Honestly, sweetheart, you were raised for better than a man who can't even valet properly. The restaurant had gone quiet in that specific way expensive restaurants do. Not silent, just watching. I felt the heat rise in my collar, but I kept my voice level. That's always been my currency. Calm, control. Sterling wanted a reaction, and I wasn't going to hand him one. You're standing on money you didn't earn, talking to a man who doesn't need to prove anything to you, I said quietly. Walk away, Sterling. This doesn't need to go anywhere. I expected him to bristle. I expected Lyra to laugh it off, maybe roll her eyes at Sterling the way she always did at pretentious men from her old world. Instead, she stood up so fast her chair scraped against the marble floor. Stop it, she snapped. Not at Sterling, at me. Lyra. The slap came before I finished her name. It cracked across the restaurant like a gunshot, sharp enough that somewhere behind me I heard a fork drop against a plate. My cheek burned instantly, but it wasn't the pain that stopped my breath. It was her face. There was no confusion in it, no regret, just embarrassment. The kind you feel when someone catches you standing next to something you're ashamed of. You humiliate me, she hissed, loud enough for the whole room to hear. In front of real people, Kaelen. I am so tired of pretending you're enough. She grabbed her clutch off the table, and then, in front of 200 strangers, my own reflection in the window behind her, and a velvet box still sitting open between 2 untouched glasses of champagne, Lyra took Sterling's arm and walked out of the restaurant. She didn't look back. I sat there for a moment. The whole room was watching me now, waiting to see what a humiliated man does next. Would I chase her? Cry? Throw the box across the room? I did none of that. I closed the velvet box, slid it into my jacket pocket, and reached for my wallet. I laid a crisp $100 bill on the table, more than enough for a meal neither of us finished, and I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked toward the door like a man leaving a mildly disappointing business meeting. Outside, Chicago was drenched in rain, the kind that turns the whole skyline into smeared gold light on wet pavement. I stood under the awning for a second, feeling the sting still radiating across my cheek, and something inside me went very, very quiet. People think heartbreak is loud. It isn't. Not for me. It's the moment right after the noise stops, when you finally hear yourself think clearly for the first time in years. I had spent 5 years hiding an entire life from the woman I loved, because I wanted, just once, to be chosen for nothing but me. No company, no empire, no name that opened doors before I even walked through them. I wanted to know that if everything I owned disappeared tomorrow, she would still be sitting across from me at that table. Tonight, she answered that question in front of 200 witnesses and a man wearing his father's watch like a personality. I stepped into the rain, pulled out my phone, and typed a single message to my head of security in Seattle. Prep the jet. I'm coming home and find out everything about Sterling Vance Hayes. Behind me, the golden windows of the Apex Lounge blurred into the storm. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel broken. I felt something far more dangerous. I felt awake. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I sat in the back of a car for almost 2 hours, watching Chicago blur past the window, while my head of security, Marcus, briefed me over a secure line about Sterling Vance Hayes. Inherited firm, over-leveraged, drowning in debt he'd hidden behind a good tailor and a better smile. None of it surprised me. Men like Sterling were predictable, all shine, no structure. What did surprise me was how long Lyra had apparently known him before tonight. Longer, Marcus said carefully, than 5 years. I told him to keep digging and hung up. By the time I reached the penthouse, it was almost 2 in the morning. The apartment was empty, the way it always was when Lyra went out with her old crowd, except tonight it felt different, quieter, like the walls themselves knew something had ended. I didn't turn on the main lights. I didn't need to. I'd lived in that apartment long enough to move through it in the dark, and honestly, I preferred it that way tonight. Less to look at, less to remember. I went straight to the bedroom closet and pulled down 2 suitcases. People imagine breakups like mine happen in a blur of rage. Smashed vases, screamed accusations, whiskey glasses thrown at walls. That's not who I am, and it never has been. I packed the way I do everything else in my life, methodically, efficiently, without wasted motion. Suits first, folded the way my old assistant taught me, back before I could afford someone to fold them for me. Then the essentials: passport, watches, the small fireproof case holding documents that mattered. The velvet box went in last, tucked into the inside pocket of my travel jacket. I hadn't decided yet what to do with the ring. Some part of me, the part that still remembered the woman who used to fall asleep with her head on my chest during thunderstorms, wasn't ready to throw it away. Not yet. Then I went to the home office and pulled every hard drive from the server rack built into the closet behind my desk. 5 years of encrypted files, patent drafts, communications with Aetherist leadership. All of it lived here, disguised as nothing more than a freelance designer's backup drives. Lyra had walked past that closet 1,000 times and never once asked what was inside it. I used to think that was respect for my privacy. Tonight, I understood it differently. She'd never asked because she'd never cared enough to wonder. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint accounts that, on paper, belonged to both of us, but that I alone had funded for 5 years through a private allowance routed from an offshore holding structure Lyra didn't know existed. It took 11 minutes to formally revoke her access and route the remaining balance into a locked trust. Not out of spite, just clarity. Money is a language, and tonight I was done speaking hers. The wedding ring, the one I'd given her 2 years ago, when I still believed permanence was something you could promise a person before you fully knew them, sat on the nightstand where she always left it before parties, so it doesn't get scratched, she used to say. I picked it up, turned it once in the low light, and set it gently on the kitchen island instead. Beside it, I placed a single folder. Inside was a deed. Signed, notarized, dated that same night by a lawyer I'd called at midnight and paid handsomely for his silence and speed. Full ownership of the penthouse, transferred entirely into Lyra's name. No mortgage attached, because there'd never been one. I'd bought the place outright years ago, under a shell entity even she didn't know about. It looked, on the surface, like generosity, a parting gift. The kind of thing a heartbroken but decent man does on his way out the door. It was also a trap with no trigger, because I knew exactly what that deed would become the moment my name and my income disappeared from her life. Property tax on a penthouse like that ran close to 6 figures a year. Maintenance fees alone would swallow a modest salary whole. Lyra had never once looked at a bill in 5 years. I'd made sure of that, quietly, the way I made sure of everything. She had no idea what it cost to simply exist in the tower she was about to inherit. I wasn't leaving her a home. I was leaving her a countdown clock. By 3:40 a.m., the suitcases were by the door, and the hard drives were packed into a reinforced case. I stood in the doorway for one last moment, looking back at the apartment where I'd built a life around a lie I told for love, and I felt the strange, hollow calm of someone closing a book they already know the ending to. I took out my personal phone, the one Lyra had called 100 times, the one with 5 years of our photos still saved in it. And I didn't smash it. I didn't need to. I opened the settings, wiped the device completely, and handed it to Marcus, who was waiting downstairs by the car. This number no longer exists, I told him. Not disconnected. Erased. If anyone tries to reach it, I want them to hit a wall, not a voicemail. He nodded once and made the calls that needed to be made. We reached the private hangar just before 4 in the morning, rain still falling in that same thin, relentless Chicago drizzle. I climbed the stairs onto the jet without looking back at the skyline, without checking my phone for messages that would never come, without a single flicker of hesitation. Somewhere behind me, in a penthouse she didn't yet understand she couldn't afford, Lyra was still out celebrating with a man whose empire was already quietly bleeding out. She had no idea the ground beneath both of them was about to disappear. Neither, yet, did I know exactly how far I was willing to let it fall. The jet's engines came alive beneath me, and Chicago dropped away into the dark. Seattle greeted me with gray skies and the particular silence I'd missed more than I expected. I hadn't slept on the flight. I never do when my mind is working through something, and mine had spent 6 hours turning over one question I couldn't quite answer. Had Lyra ever loved the man I actually was, or only the version of him small enough to make her feel superior? By the time the car pulled into the underground garage at Aetherus Dynamics headquarters, I'd stopped asking. Questions like that don't have clean answers, and I've never had patience for messy ones. The building rose 40 stories above the Seattle waterfront. Glass and steel wrapped around one of the most valuable AI architecture firms in the world. And for 5 years, almost no one outside a small circle of executives and lawyers had known that the man running it wasn't some reclusive founder hiding behind a corporate mythology. It was me, Vector. The alias had started as a joke, honestly. A placeholder name on an early patent filing, back when I was 26, and didn't yet understand that the identity would need to survive a decade of scrutiny. I built Aetherus from a garage lab and 3 engineers who believed in an idea nobody else did. a self-optimizing neural architecture that could restructure itself faster than any system on the market. By the time the industry understood what we'd built, I had already made the decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I would run the empire from behind a curtain and live my actual life, my real one, the one with mornings and coffee and a woman I loved, under a name nobody could trace back to a balance sheet. I wanted, more than anything, to know what it felt like to be chosen for nothing. Now I understood the answer, and it had left a mark on my face I could still feel if I pressed my fingers to my cheek. The elevator opened directly into the executive floor, and my chief of staff, Naomi, was already waiting, portfolio in hand, expression carefully neutral, in the way people learn to be neutral around someone they've never once seen lose control. "Sir, welcome back." A pause, the briefest flicker of concern. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Boardroom, now. She didn't ask questions. That was one of the things I valued most about the people I kept close. They understood that my silence usually meant something was already in motion, long before I said a word about it. The boardroom on the 40th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, and I took my seat at the head of the table the way I always did. Not with ceremony, just ownership. 6 of my senior legal team filed in behind Naomi, along with my chief financial officer, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya, who had run numbers for me since the earliest days of the company. "Talk to me," I said. Priya slid a portfolio across the table. "Hayes Global, Sterling Vance Hayes' firm. They've been licensing our core AI network architecture for the last 2 years, the framework behind our adaptive processing suite. Standard commercial agreement, renewed annually." "I'm aware of the license," I said. "What am I looking at that I'm not already aware of?" She tapped the second page. "They've leveraged 80% of the company's capital against future licensing rights to our architecture. Essentially, Sterling took massive loans using our technology as collateral value, betting that renewed access to our systems would keep investor confidence high enough to cover the debt." I felt something settle in my chest. Not surprise exactly, recognition. The kind you feel when a puzzle piece you'd suspected finally clicks into place. "He's using my technology to prop up a company he doesn't have the discipline to run," I said quietly. "Essentially, yes," Priya said. "And he's doing it while negotiating renewal terms with a licensing board he believes is being run by absentee executives. He has no idea the board answers directly to you. As far as Hayes Global is concerned, they're dealing with a faceless corporate structure, not," she hesitated slightly, "not the man himself." I almost laughed. Almost. Sterling had spent an entire dinner mocking me for driving a leased sedan, unaware that the technology holding his empire together for the last 2 years belonged to the loser he'd humiliated in front of 200 strangers. He didn't know it yet, but he'd been standing in my shadow the entire time, sneering at a reflection he couldn't recognize. I opened the licensing agreement myself, scanning past the boilerplate, until I found the clause I already knew existed, because I'd written the framework of these contracts myself, years ago. Section 14.3, Non-Compliance and Breach of Exclusivity Terms. "Has Hayes Global violated the exclusivity clause?" I asked. My general counsel, a measured man named Dorian who rarely offered opinions unless asked directly, cleared his throat. "Technically, yes. Minor infractions, subletting partial access to a third-party fintech partner without formal disclosure. Under normal circumstances, we'd issue a warning and a grace period. We're not doing normal circumstances," I said. Silence settled over the table. Naomi glanced at me, and I could tell she was reading something in my expression that none of the lawyers could quite name yet. Not anger, not vengeance in the theatrical sense. Just precision. The same quiet clarity I'd felt standing in the rain outside the Apex Lounge less than 24 hours ago. Trigger the non-compliance clause, I said. Full revocation of licensing rights, effective immediately. Demand repayment of all back-owed royalties within 48 hours, per contract terms. Dorian's pen paused over his notepad. Sir, that will collapse their access to core systems overnight. Given how leveraged they are, I'm aware of what it will do. This will be catastrophic for Hayes Global. I looked out at the gray water beyond the windows, thinking of $100 bill left on a white tablecloth, and a slap that still burned faintly against my cheek. Good, I said. Send the notice. Nobody in that room argued with me again. I didn't watch the collapse happen from a boardroom. I watched it happen from 30,000 feet, on a private flight to New York, because some victories don't need you standing in the room to feel real. They just need time. By the time I landed, the notice had already gone out. 48 hours. That was all Sterling had before Hayes Global's licensing rights disappeared, and every system his firm had quietly built its promises on went dark. I checked into my office suite in Manhattan just after 10 the next morning, and Naomi was already waiting with a tablet in hand and the kind of expression people wear when they're trying very hard not to look impressed. It's moving faster than projected, she said, sliding the screen toward me. The financial news feed was already lit up, Hayes Global shares in free fall amid sudden tech licensing collapse. A second headline beneath it, sharper, investors demand answers as Hayes Global's core AI partnership vanishes overnight. I scrolled through the numbers myself. Down 40% by mid-morning. By 11, down 58. I poured a coffee, sat by the window overlooking the city, and watched the ticker climb downward, like a slow, inevitable tide pulling a sandcastle apart, grain by grain. By 11:30, it had dropped 70%. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes with watching something you built with your own hands take down something someone else built on borrowed confidence. It isn't loud satisfaction, it's stillness. The same stillness I'd felt walking out of the Apex Lounge 2 weeks earlier, except now it had a number attached to it. 70%. And climbing. Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then at me, her eyebrows lifting slightly. You'll want to see this. She turned the screen. A photo, pulled from a gossip account that tracked New York's social elite far too closely for anyone's comfort. Lyra, arriving at Hayes Global's headquarters that same morning, dressed like she still believed the world she'd chosen was solid ground. The caption read, Sterling Vance Hayes's new companion spotted arriving amid company turmoil. She doesn't know yet, I said. It wasn't a question. Doesn't look like it. I imagined her walking into that lobby, expecting champagne and admiration, the life Sterling's name was supposed to guarantee her, and instead finding federal auditors moving through the building like a slow-motion raid, investors shouting into phones, security escorting nervous junior staff out through side doors. I imagined the exact moment her heels stopped clicking confidently across the marble floor and started hesitating. I didn't have to imagine long. Marcus called an hour later, with an update pulled from surveillance his team still maintained around Lyra out of old habit, a habit I hadn't yet told him to break. She tried to reach you, he said, multiple times. My number doesn't exist anymore, I reminded him. She doesn't know that yet either. She kept calling. Every attempt returned the same deadline error. Eventually, she had someone check it manually. The number's been permanently deactivated and stripped from every carrier database. No forwarding, no voicemail, nothing. As far as any system on Earth is concerned, Kaelen Ashworth's personal phone never existed. There was a strange kind of poetry in that. For 5 years, I'd built an entire second identity, so convincing that even the woman who shared my bed never questioned it. Now, in the space of 2 weeks, I'd erased the identity she did know completely, and the one she never knew existed was the only version of me left standing. What did she need money for? I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't surprise me. Housing taxes, Marcus said. On the penthouse. The transfer went through cleanly. She's the sole owner now, but the maintenance fees came due last week, and the property tax assessment landed 2 days ago. 6 figures, due within 30 days. She doesn't have access to it. Your joint accounts were closed the night you left, and apparently Sterling isn't in a position to help anyone right now. No, I agreed. He isn't. I thought about the deed I'd left on the kitchen island, the ring beside it glinting under the low apartment light. A parting gift. I'd told myself that night, though even then some part of me had known exactly what I was really leaving behind. Not generosity, a slow-closing door, with her name carved into the frame. By early afternoon, the story had fully broken across financial media. Hayes Global's stock had been suspended from trading pending review. Sterling, according to 2 separate outlets, had gone completely silent. No statement, no appearance, no explanation for how a firm with his family's century-old reputation had imploded in under 2 days. Naomi appeared in my doorway again around 3, her voice careful. "There's something else you should know. Go ahead." Lyra tried reaching out to 2 of your former colleagues from the design studio. The cover identity you used before Aetheris went public internally. She's asking around, trying to figure out where you've gone, who you actually work for. Nobody she's spoken to knows anything real. As far as the world is concerned, Kaelen Ashworth, the freelance designer, simply vanished. I nodded slowly, watching the skyline outside my window shift from afternoon gold into the first hints of evening blue. "Let her ask," I said. Because somewhere in Manhattan, in an office tower currently swarming with auditors and abandoned promises, Lyra was standing in the wreckage of a life she thought would replace the one she'd thrown away, and she still had no idea that the man she'd slapped in front of 200 strangers wasn't gone. He'd simply stopped being visible, and visibility, I was beginning to understand, was the only thing I'd ever really given her. I flew to Boston under a security detail, so quiet that even the pilot didn't know the actual purpose of the trip until we'd landed. Some visits don't belong on a corporate calendar. This was one of them. 45 days had passed since the Apex Lounge. 45 days since a slap that still occasionally surfaced in my memory at strange hours. Not painfully anymore, but factually, like a data point I'd already processed and filed away. In that time, Aetheris had absorbed 2 new licensing partners to replace the gap left by Hayes Global. Sterling's company was in the final stages of a bankruptcy filing that financial analysts were already calling one of the fastest corporate collapses of the decade. And I had spent most of my waking hours making sure my empire never again depended on being hidden to feel safe. But there was one person from my old life I hadn't cut off, and I had no intention of starting now. Eleanor Whitfield, Lyra's mother, had never fit the mold of the family she came from. Where Lyra's father treated every relationship like a transaction and every guest like a potential investor, Eleanor had always looked at me like I was simply a person worth knowing, long before she understood what I was actually worth on paper. She used to bring me soup when I caught colds during the early years, back when I was still building Aetheris out of a cramped apartment and pretending, even to her, that I sold freelance design work for a living. She deserved better than to disappear into the wreckage of her daughter's choices. We met at a small coffee shop in a quiet Boston suburb, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, chosen specifically because nobody there would recognize either of us. Eleanor looked older than I remembered, not fragile, just tired in the particular way people get tired when they're carrying weight that isn't theirs to carry. Kaelen, she reached across the small table and took my hand before I'd even fully sat down. I didn't think you'd actually come. I told you I would. I'd called her 2 weeks earlier, briefly, just enough to arrange this. I hadn't explained everything. I wasn't sure I needed to yet. She studied my face for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, of a version of me she'd always sensed, but never been told about outright. "You're him, aren't you?" she said quietly. Not really a question. Vector, the man from the news. The one who, she gestured vaguely, as if the scale of it was too large to summarize in a sentence. The one who ended Sterling's company. Yes. She let out a slow breath, wrapping both hands around her tea. I suspected, near the end, you always had a way of paying for things too easily for a freelance designer. Lyra never noticed. I did. A small, sad smile. Mothers usually do. I nodded, letting her set the pace of the conversation. This wasn't about me proving anything. I already knew what I needed to know. "Tell me what's happening to her," I said. Eleanor's expression tightened, and for a moment, I watched her weigh how much honesty to give me. She'd always been careful that way, protective, even of people who probably didn't deserve it anymore. "Sterling left her within days of the collapse," she said finally. "The moment the auditors froze his personal accounts, he told her, and I'm quoting him directly, because Lyra repeated it to me through tears, that she'd brought him nothing but bad luck since the day she walked into his life. He blamed her, Kaelen, as if she'd caused any of it. I felt nothing at that. No satisfaction, no pity, just the quiet confirmation of something I'd already understood about Sterling the night he stood over our table with a smirk he thought would outlast consequences. "And the penthouse?" I asked. "Gone, or nearly. She's had to list it for a fire sale. The taxes alone were more than she could manage, and without—" Eleanor paused delicately. "Without your income, she has nothing left to draw from. She's been staying in a rented studio near the old neighborhood. Small. Nothing like what she's used to." She looked up at me. "She's been trying to find your old contacts, Kaelen. Desperately. She thinks if she can just explain herself to the right person, someone will lead her back to you." "She won't find anything," I said. "Kaelen Ashworth, freelance designer, doesn't exist anymore. He hasn't for months." Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing that, and then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand again. Not out of sympathy for Lyra this time, but for me. "I'm sorry for what she did to you," she said. "I raised her better than that slap. I don't know what happened to the daughter I taught to value people over status." "You don't owe me an apology for her choices," I said, "but I didn't ask you here just to update you." I reached into my jacket and slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a document my legal team had prepared days earlier. A trust account, fully funded, established solely in Eleanor's name. Enough to cover her home, her medical needs, and a retirement she'd spent decades postponing to help raise a daughter who no longer seemed to remember the values she'd been taught. Eleanor opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the numbers, and I watched her hand come up to cover her mouth. "Kaelen, this is—" she started. "It's yours," I said. "Not Lyra's. I need you to understand that clearly, Eleanor. Not a single cent of this reaches her, under any circumstance. I'm not doing this to hurt her further. I'm doing it because you were the only person in that family who ever treated me like I mattered before you knew what I was worth." Eleanor's eyes filled, and for a long moment she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She has no idea what she lost, does she?" I looked out the window at the quiet Boston street, thinking of a woman hunting desperately through a life that no longer existed, chasing a name that had already vanished into the wind. No, I said, but she's about to find out. 3 months after the Apex Lounge, I was standing in a glass-walled testing lab in Seattle, watching a demo of Aetheris's newest adaptive architecture render in real time, when Marcus called with news that made me set my coffee down slower than I meant to. "She found you," he said, "or close to it." I'd been expecting this eventually. I just hadn't expected it this soon, and I hadn't expected the method. According to Marcus's team, Lyra, increasingly desperate, increasingly broke, and increasingly convinced that finding Kaelen the designer would somehow unlock a version of her old life, had hired a private investigator with the last of the money she'd salvaged from the penthouse sale. Not a particularly good investigator, Marcus noted, but a persistent one, willing to dig where more careful professionals wouldn't bother. The penthouse itself had sold 2 weeks earlier, well below market value, to a buyer eager to close quickly. What the new owners hadn't cleared out yet was a storage unit in the building's sub-basement. One I'd forgotten still held old equipment from years before Aetheris had scaled into what it was now. Early prototype devices, backup drives I'd assumed were long wiped. And, buried in a box of outdated hardware, an old developer key, a physical authentication token I'd used back when Aetheris was still small enough that I personally signed off on core patent filings under my real name before the alias structure had fully matured. I'd forgotten it existed. That was the problem with hiding for 5 years. Eventually, you accumulate more evidence of your real life than you remember to erase. The investigator, working off nothing more than persistence and a decent eye for detail, had traced the serial number on that key back through a chain of patent registry filings that, buried deep enough, eventually connected to Aetheris Dynamics' original incorporation documents. And there, in black and white, beneath layers of legal structuring designed to keep exactly this kind of discovery from happening, my name. Not Vector, not some corporate shell. Kaelen Ashworth, listed as founding architect and majority shareholder of a company now valued at several $billion. How much does she actually know? I asked. Enough, Marcus said. The investigator gave her the registry documents 2 days ago. She knows Kaelen Ashworth and Vector are the same person. She knows you've run Aetheris this entire time. She hasn't gone to press with it. Not yet. But given her financial situation, I wouldn't assume that's out of loyalty. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. Part of me had always known this day might come. Secrets that large rarely stay buried forever, especially not once someone with enough motivation starts digging with nothing left to lose. What surprised me wasn't the discovery itself. It was how little I felt about it. 3 months ago, the idea of Lyra learning the truth would have terrified me. Not because of exposure, but because of what it would have meant about the 5 years before it. That she'd only ever loved the version of me with a balance sheet attached. Now, the revelation just felt like a fact settling into place, the way weather settles into a season. Inevitable. Unremarkable. Do we need to worry about the press angle? I asked. I don't think so, Marcus said. My read is she's not interested in exposing you publicly. Given her situation, that would burn the one connection she might still hope to use privately. I think she's sitting on it, trying to figure out what to do with it. I thought about that for a long moment, staring out at the gray water beyond the lab's windows. Let her sit with it, I said. Don't intervene. Don't reach out. I want to see what she does with the truth, once she actually has it. I didn't have to wait long. Naomi found me 2 days later with a message that had come through Aetheris's general press inquiry line. Not from a journalist, but from Lyra herself. Using a personal email account I recognized instantly. An old address she'd used back when we first met. Back before either of us knew what the other actually was. I read it once, standing at my office window, the Seattle skyline blurring slightly at the edges the longer I stared at it. Kaelen, I know who you are. I know what I did. I don't expect you to believe me, but I need you to know. I didn't slap you because of who you were pretending to be. I slapped you because I was scared of what Sterling's world would think of what I actually had. I was ashamed of myself, not of you. I understand now that I threw away something real, chasing something that was never going to be. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for the company or anything you've built. I just need 5 minutes to say I'm sorry, in person, before I let this go for good. Elelni. I read it 3 times. Then I closed the message and set my phone face down on the desk, watching the reflection of the city ripple faintly in the dark glass of my window. There was a version of me, months ago, who might have felt something reading those words. Hope, maybe, or the old familiar ache of wanting to believe someone loved you for reasons that had nothing to do with what you could give them. That version of me had died quietly the moment a hand connected with my face in front of 200 strangers, and no amount of carefully worded regret was going to resurrect him now. I didn't respond to the email, not yet. Instead, I opened my calendar and looked at the date circled in red 3 weeks out. The Austin Tech Summit, where Etheris would formally step into the public eye for the first time under my real name, in front of every major investor, journalist, and industry leader in the world. If Lyra wanted her 5 minutes, she was going to have to find me there, in front of everyone, exactly the way I'd once found myself standing alone in a restaurant she'd walked out of without looking back. Some doors, I decided, deserved to close in public. Austin in the evening had a particular kind of heat to it, thick, restless, the kind that clung to your skin even after the sun dropped behind the skyline. I stood on the private terrace of my suite at the Glass House Hotel, looking out over a city about to become the backdrop for the most important 24 hours of Aetheris's public existence, and tried not to think about the email still sitting unanswered in my inbox. Naomi found me there just after 7, her expression carrying the particular tightness she reserved for problems she didn't yet know how to categorize. "She's here," she said simply. I didn't need to ask who. "Downstairs, in the lobby," Naomi continued. "She used her mother's old contact information to get a temporary press credential for tomorrow's summit. I'm not entirely sure how, given the summit's security clearance requirements, but she's here, and she's asking for you by name, not Vector, Kaelen." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and precise, not surprise. I'd half expected this the moment I read her email 3 weeks ago. Some people don't wait for an invitation. Some people force the door open themselves. "Bring her to the private lounge," I said, "not the suite, and keep security nearby." 15 minutes later, I stood in the dimly lit VIP lounge on the executive floor, a private space reserved for board members and major investors, and watched the elevator doors slide open. Lyra looked nothing like the woman who'd walked out of the Apex Lounge on Sterling's arm 5 months earlier. Gone was the effortless polish, the tailored dress that once looked like armor. She wore something simpler now, something that had clearly been chosen with less money and more urgency. Her hair was pulled back plainly. Dark circles sat beneath eyes that had once looked at me like I was the safest place in the world, and for one unguarded second when she saw me, I watched that same look try to resurface, before exhaustion and desperation pulled it back under. "Kaelen," her voice cracked on my name, like she hadn't said it aloud in a long time and had forgotten how much weight it carried. "You have 5 minutes," I said, staying near the window, deliberately keeping distance between us. "That's what you asked for in your email." She crossed the room quickly, and before I could react, she was on her knees in front of me. Actually on her knees, in the middle of a private lounge, 60 floors above Austin, sobbing in a way that would have destroyed me completely 5 months ago. "I'm so sorry," she said, gripping the edge of my jacket. "Kaelen, please, I know I don't deserve 5 minutes. I don't deserve any of your time. But I need you to understand. Sterling, he made me feel like I was nothing, without status, without money, without people looking at me a certain way. I got caught up in something that wasn't real. I was scared and stupid, and I let him convince me that you weren't enough. When you were always enough. You were always more than enough." I looked down at her, and for a long moment, I simply let the silence sit between us. 5 months ago, this exact scene, Lyra broken, desperate, begging for forgiveness, would have undone every carefully constructed wall I'd built around myself. I would have knelt down beside her. I would have believed her. But 5 months is a long time to sit with a single, undeniable fact. She didn't cry like this the night she left. She didn't beg then. She only started begging once she discovered what I was actually worth. "You didn't hit me because you were confused, Lyra," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that seemed to unsettle her more than any anger could have. "You've told yourself that story so many times, you probably believe it now. But that's not what happened, Kaelen. You hit me," I continued, cutting through her protest with the same calm precision I used in every boardroom I'd walked into over the last 5 months. Because in that moment, standing in front of Sterling and everyone who mattered to your world, you believed I was powerless. You believed I had nothing worth protecting, nothing worth defending, and that made me disposable to you. That's not confusion, that's judgment. And you made yours very clearly, in front of 200 witnesses. Her sobbing intensified, her grip on my jacket tightening. I didn't know who you really were. That's exactly the point, I said. You didn't need to know who I really was to treat me with basic respect. You didn't slap a stranger that night, Lyra. You slapped the man you'd shared a bed with for 5 years, because you thought his humility meant he was worthless. The only thing that's changed since then is your math, not your character. She looked up at me, mascara streaked beneath her eyes, and for the first time all evening, I saw something other than desperation flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, of just how far beyond reach I actually was now, not because of money, but because of everything the money had revealed about who she really was underneath the fear. "Please," she whispered, "just give me a chance to show you I've changed." I crouched down slightly, close enough that she probably thought, for one brief second, that I might finally reach for her hand. I didn't. "You had 5 years to show me who you were," I said quietly. "You did. I believed you. Once. I'm not interested in a second edition of the same story." I straightened, turned toward the door, and signaled to the 2 security personnel waiting quietly near the entrance. "Escort her to the ground floor," I said. "Cancel her press credential. She's not attending tomorrow's summit." "Kaelen, please." Her voice broke behind me, raw and pleading, as the security team gently but firmly helped her to her feet. I didn't turn around. I walked back toward the window, looking out over the glittering skyline of a city about to watch me step fully into the light for the first time. And behind me, I heard the elevator doors close on the last chapter of a woman who'd once held my entire heart in her hands and dropped it without a second thought. The Austin Convention Center held nearly 6,000 people that morning, and every seat had a story behind it. Investors who'd tripled their portfolios betting on Ethereus patents they didn't fully understand. Journalists who'd spent 5 months trying to identify the mysterious founder behind the world's fastest-growing AI architecture firm. Engineers who'd built careers on frameworks I'd designed in a cramped apartment before any of this existed. None of them knew what I looked like. Not really. Vector had been a name on filings, a signature on contracts, a voice occasionally heard on investor calls through a modulated line my legal team insisted on for exactly this kind of protection. Today, for the first time in the company's history, that ended. I stood backstage, running through the keynote structure one final time with Naomi, and I felt none of the nervous energy I might have expected from a moment this large. I'd spent 5 months rebuilding everything that mattered to me from the ground up. My company's public face, my understanding of what loyalty actually looked like, my tolerance for pretending to be smaller than I was. Walking onto that stage didn't feel like exposure. It felt like arrival. 90 seconds, the stage manager said through my earpiece. I glanced at Naomi. Any updates on this morning? She hesitated, which told me everything before she spoke. She's here. In the public gallery, not the press section. We pulled her credential, so she bought a general admission ticket instead. 3rd row, aisle seat. I wasn't surprised. Some people don't know how to let a door close, even after they've been physically walked through it once. I nodded once, absorbing the information without letting it change anything in my expression. Understood, I said. It doesn't change anything about this morning. The lights dropped. The auditorium fell into that particular hush that precedes something the audience has been anticipating for months, and I walked onto the stage under a spotlight, into a silence so complete I could hear my own footsteps against the polished floor. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying clean and steady through the auditorium's sound system. "For 5 years, most of you have known me only as Vector. Today, that changes." I let the pause sit exactly as long as it needed to. "My name is Kaelen Ashworth. I founded Etheris Dynamics 8 years ago in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 engineers who believed in an idea nobody else did. I built this company under an alias, not out of shame, but because I wanted the freedom to live a private life untouched by what I'd built. I've since learned that hiding who you are, even for good reasons, always costs you something. Today, I'm done paying that particular price." The applause that followed lasted longer than I expected. I let it happen without performing gratitude I didn't fully feel yet. The moment still felt more like closure than celebration. I moved through the keynote exactly as planned. New adaptive architecture benchmarks that outpaced every competitor currently on the market. A live demonstration that drew audible gasps from engineers in the front rows who understood exactly what they were watching. And then, near the end, the announcement I'd been building toward for months. Etheris Dynamics will be opening a new international headquarters in Tokyo within the next 18 months, I said, watching the slide behind me shift to renderings of a glass tower rising above Shinjuku. Alongside that expansion, we're launching a multi-billion-dollar philanthropic foundation focused on equitable access to advanced technology education, starting in communities that built the talent pipeline this industry has quietly depended on for decades without giving back. The applause this time was immediate, sustained, the kind that comes from an audience realizing they're witnessing something larger than a product launch. I moved into the Q&A segment feeling steadier than I had in months, taking questions from a rotation of journalists positioned throughout the auditorium. Questions about architecture scalability, about the Tokyo expansion timeline, about the philanthropic foundation's structure. I answered each one with the same measured clarity I'd used in every boardroom for the past 5 months. And then, near the edge of my vision, in the 3rd row, I saw a hand rise, not from the press section, from the general public seating, from a woman whose face I would have recognized in any lighting, in any crowd, in any lifetime. Lyra sat with her hand half raised, tears already visible even from the distance of the stage, her expression a desperate mixture of hope and hollow recognition. as if some part of her still believed that if she could just get my attention, just get one moment of eye contact in front of everyone, something between us might still be salvageable. I saw the movement. I registered it completely, and then I looked past her, toward a journalist 3 seats over, with her hand raised more formally, notepad ready. "Yes, go ahead," I said, my voice betraying absolutely nothing. The journalist asked about international regulatory challenges for AI architecture licensing across different markets, and I answered thoroughly, thoughtfully, my attention never once drifting back toward the 3rd row, where a woman I'd once planned to marry sat crying silently in a sea of 6,000 strangers, watching the man she'd once called worthless build something too large for her to ever touch again. I took 4 more questions after that. Each time her hand rose, slightly higher, slightly more desperate, and each time I selected a different questioner, my expression as steady and unbothered as if she were simply another face in a crowd I didn't recognize. Because that, I realized somewhere around the 3rd unanswered question, was exactly what she'd become. When the session ended, the applause rose around me like a tide, and I stepped back from the podium, nodding once to the audience, before turning toward the wings. I didn't look at the 3rd row again. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of an audience still buzzing with everything they'd just witnessed. A company's future, a founder's reveal, an empire stepping fully into the light. None of them noticed the woman quietly gathering her things in the 3rd row, wiping her face before anyone around her could ask what was wrong. I did notice. I simply chose, for the first time in my life, not to let it matter. 6 months to the day since the Apex Lounge, I stood on the balcony of my new office in Shinjuku, watching the neon skyline of Tokyo bleed color into a sky already darkening toward evening. The city moved beneath me in that particular electric rhythm only Tokyo seems to have, relentless, glittering, indifferent to any single person's history. I'd always liked that about it. A city too large to care what you'd survived to get there. The Tokyo headquarters had opened 2 weeks ahead of schedule, a 40-story glass structure rising above Shinjuku's skyline, staffed with engineers pulled from 6 countries, and a leadership team I'd built from the ground up, without a single person on it who'd known me as anything other than exactly who I was. No hidden identity, no careful separation between the man and the company. For the first time since I'd founded Aetheris, there was no curtain left to maintain. It had taken some adjusting, this version of my life. 6 months ago, walking into a room meant calculating what version of myself the moment required. Now I simply walked in as Kaelen Ashworth, and the room adjusted to me instead. Naomi found me on the balcony just after 7, a slim folder tucked under her arm, her expression carrying the careful neutrality she reserved for news she suspected I'd want delivered, without commentary. "This arrived from the Chicago legal office this morning," she said, holding out the folder. "Certified correspondence. It's regarding the spousal support filing. I hadn't thought about the filing in weeks." Lyra had submitted her claim almost 4 months earlier, shortly after the Austin summit, through a lawyer clearly working on a contingency basis given her financial state. A last, desperate attempt to draw some portion of the wealth she'd once dismissed as beneath her attention. "What's the ruling?" I asked, not reaching for the folder yet. "Denied, completely." Naomi's voice stayed even, professional. "The court cited the prenuptial agreement you had drawn up in the early years of the relationship, specifically the clause barring any spousal claims in cases of documented physical aggression toward the other party. The restaurant incident was witnessed by over 200 people, several of whom gave statements. There wasn't much room for interpretation. I remembered signing that prenup years ago, back when Lyra had rolled her eyes at the formality of it, calling it unnecessary, between 2 people who trusted each other completely. I'd insisted anyway, not because I anticipated this exact outcome, but because I'd learned early in my career that protection built before you need it is the only protection that actually works. Anything else in the filing? I asked. Naomi hesitated, which was answer enough before she spoke. There's a personal note attached. Not part of the legal filing, something her lawyer forwarded separately at her request. I haven't opened it. It's addressed to you directly. She held the folder out again, and this time I took it, turning it over once in my hands without opening it. I already knew, roughly, what it would say. Some version of the same plea she'd offered on her knees in that Austin lounge. Regret dressed up as reflection. Desperation reframed as growth. I'd heard that particular speech enough times now to recite it myself if I wanted to. What else do you know about her situation? I asked instead, setting the unopened folder on the balcony railing. Naomi checked her notes. She's renting a small studio outside Chicago, working retail at a department store to cover living costs and outstanding legal fees from the failed filing. From what our contacts could gather, most of her old social circle disappeared, along with the Hayes global collapse. Sterling hasn't been in contact with her since the week his accounts were frozen. I nodded slowly, absorbing the information the way I absorbed any operational update, factually, without letting it settle anywhere close to the parts of me that used to ache over her. There had been a time, months ago, when news like this might have stirred something complicated in me. A flicker of guilt, maybe, or the old instinct to fix things simply because I had the resources to. That instinct had died somewhere between a hotel lounge in Austin and a stage in front of 6,000 strangers, replaced by something steadier. Not cruelty, just clarity about where my responsibility ended and her choices began. Should I have the note reviewed before responding? Naomi asked. In case there's anything relevant, legally or otherwise. I looked out at the Tokyo skyline, the city's endless lights stretching toward a horizon I'd chosen deliberately, as far from Chicago, from the Apex Lounge, from a slap that had once defined the worst night of my life, as I could reasonably place myself. No, I said. Shred it. Don't read it first. I don't need to know what it says. Naomi didn't question the instruction. She simply nodded, tucked the folder back under her arm, and turned to leave the balcony, pausing only briefly at the door. For what it's worth, she said, I think you handled all of this better than most people would have. I considered that for a moment, turning back toward the skyline as the last edge of daylight disappeared behind Tokyo's towers, replaced entirely by the electric glow of a city that never quite went dark. I didn't handle it, I said quietly. I just stopped waiting for her to become someone she was never going to be. Naomi left without responding, and I stood alone on the balcony for a long while after, listening to the distant hum of the city below. Trains, traffic, 6 million lives moving forward without pause, exactly the way mine had. I picked up the espresso Naomi had left on the railing earlier, still warm, and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle before the sweetness underneath it caught up, the way it always did. Somewhere behind me, an ocean and half a continent away, a woman was folding shirts behind a retail counter, still chasing the ghost of a man who no longer existed in the way she remembered him. Ahead of me, Tokyo's skyline stretched out in every direction, endless and glittering, entirely mine to build forward into. I turned my back to the past, and I didn't look behind me again.